Ever since Resident Evil 7 debuted in 2017, Capcom has gone to a new makeshift of what Resident Evil is as a franchise, right? We all know, and most of us have grew up with the original Resident Evil, such as the static camera, the tank controls, and the horrifying experience we go into the mansion, into the police station, and so on, into the world of Raccoon City. And over time, we've had many different games of Resident Evil. Now, the newest iteration of Resident Evil 9, is coming out next year. And to me, as I have played a lot of these games almost my entire life, and it really helped me get into more of the horror genre of video games, I want to look at what I believe to be Capcom shifting away from those original titles into this newer remake world or remake timeline that they are pursuing. I'm not trying to make a claim that they are multiverses or something like, different universes that these games exist in, but kind of like Capcom is trying to make you forget about the original timeline. What I mean by the original timeline, I mean RE1 original, RE2 original, RE3 original, RE4 original. And the reason why I think that is because I think they wanted to separate that older timeline with the newer and fresher takes that they are, doing with Resident Evil, starting with Resident Evil 7. And as we all know, after Resident Evil 7 came Resident Evil 2 Remake, followed by Resident Evil 3 Remake, Resident Evil 4 Remake, Resident Evil 8, and eventually Resident Evil 9 that comes out next year. And to me, it seems like a lot of the contents that we get from the newer iterations of these games and the newer games, we are essentially not looking back at what the original games presented in terms of lore story. And so I think they are essentially splitting these two timelines into different portions, where they're trying to make the newer games more into what they want in terms of their overall view of the Resident Evil franchise, the lore, and future stories they want to tell. And this, of course, is just my own personal opinion, just based off my own research and just the feeling I get with what Capcom is trying to do here. There was even a statement from GOG Gaming, a website that you can find many older games that are probably harder to find for you to purchase and play, where Capcom executives were bewildered that people wanted to play the original Resident Evil and stated that the remakes are already the superior experience. Now, to me, this tells me that Capcom really is shifting towards this newer timeline, the remakes 7, 8, and 9, and future remakes such as Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil 5 remake and so on, as the newer timeline. That the lore for this new timeline is where they're going to be focusing on. Not that they're not acknowledging that the older games and the older timeline doesn't necessarily exist anymore. They're not going to be focusing on them. They're going to make some changes. They're going to do certain things to really fit the newer timeline with the future of the franchise. Now, of course, this is going to have a lot of Resident Evil fans divided about, what is the true Resident Evil, right? But I think because of the lack of success in terms of criticism of Resident Evil 6, they pivoted towards Resident Evil 7, the first-person view, and essentially the remake projects, because they felt that they needed to take Resident Evil into a new direction. Similar to how Silent Hill fans and even the Silent Hill franchise is now kind of shifting away from the original Silent Hill games and creating their own version of that, with Silent Hill F becoming the, as some fans claim, the Resident Evil 7 of Silent Hill. But to give you a better understanding of what I'm essentially talking about in terms of the new timelines, I made a little chart to just explain what the original timeline is and what the new timeline that they're trying to pursue is, right? So, with the original timeline, you have Resident Evil 0, Resident Evil OG, Resident Evil 2 OG, Resident Evil 3 OG, Resident Evil 4 OG, Resident Evil 5, and Resident Evil 6. And that's where it stops, okay? You can even include Resident Evil Revelations, you can include Resident Evil Outbreak, and all of these other games into this original timeline. Now let's move on to what I think is the newer timeline that they want to more focus and pivot towards than the original timeline. Okay, the newer timeline includes Resident Evil Remastered from 2002, Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 3 Remake, Resident Evil 4 Remake, and then we go on to Resident Evil 7, 8, and the upcoming Resident Evil 9. This is the new timeline they want, more fans to focus on, because that's where they are essentially leading into the future for the Resident Evil franchise. Now, I know there's going to be some people who will argue about this and that, the OG Resident Evil is still canon to the timeline. But to me, I think with what they're trying to do, I think they're trying to essentially erase the original timeline, just to forget about it, because they don't want you to really try and make you go way back to those original games to try to fit everything else into this new timeline. Or they feel that they want you to focus on the timeline because that's where they are currently pivoting to in the near future, and the OG stories will just not make any, sense and fit into this new timeline. Now, of course, you can definitely disagree with me. This is just my own personal view and opinion of the Resident Evil franchise. I just get this feeling that that's what they're doing. Now, there are rumors of Resident Evil 0 Remake. I heard someone mention that there could be a Resident Evil 1 remake coming out in the same style as Resident Evil 2 remake. And supposedly, if we're going along this continuous path of the new timeline, Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6 will eventually get a remake with likely changes to the story. Right? Now, some may mention certain, pieces of lore in Resident Evil 7, 8, and 9 that go back to Resident Evil 5, Resident Evil 6, and many of the other OG games. Now, I don't necessarily think that means that, those events never occurred in the new timeline. What I'm stating is essentially that we just haven't seen those events unfold yet until they release the remakes of Resident Evil 5, Resident Evil 6, and even Resident Evil 0. Right? Once we get those games, then you will see that a lot of those will fit into the newer timeline, because they will go back, make sure that everything is accurate to the new timeline lore, and continue onward as they head into past 9, into 10, 11, 12, and so on and so forth into the near future. So all the events that do occur in the OG Resident Evil 5, Resident Evil 6, Resident Evil 0 still exist in the new timeline. We just haven't seen them yet because they haven't released the remake versions of these games. And I'm sure that that's also going to include Outbreak and stuff like that, which we can only hope they remake Outbreak, because every single goddamn multiplayer game that they have thought up for Resident Evil has not panned out. So hopefully we'll get a Resident Evil Outbreak. Hopefully. Please. Because that was probably the best multiplayer Resident Evil experience they ever created. But that's essentially how I view the new timelines of the Resident Evil franchise. We have the old timeline and then you have the new timeline. Right? They don't necessarily coexist, but you can go back to the OG and experience the new timeline as kind of like a symbiotic relationship, in that one, Capcom probably is not going to have a huge focus on. They will still, well, at least it took a while for them to release the OG games onto PlayStation and even websites like GOG, to then just focusing mainly on the new timeline going forward. Now, I know a lot of people are going to essentially be kind of upset because there's so much arguments and debates about which one is better, the original or the remake of the original, such as, RE2 remake not necessarily being as lore or story well written as compared to the OG, or, for example, Resident Evil 3, just you get to explore more of Raccoon City. With Resident Evil 3 remake, you're kind of limited, they cut a lot of content, and so on and so forth. There's always going to be arguments about which version of the games is more superior. I personally think that the OG Resident Evil 3 is much better than the remake. I personally love Resident Evil 2 remake because I see it as my favorite Resident Evil game. But Resident Evil 2 OG is still fantastic. I still love to go back and play it, and as much as I really want to love Resident Evil 3 Remake, I can't. But I will go back and play Resident Evil 3 Remake, because while it isn't a bad game, there's just so much good content from it. But that's my point. Capcom isn't necessarily trying to make you not play the original games. they definitely made it hard for you to find them and buy them and, you know, play them without, you know, using ROMs or stuff like that. But I think that's where they're going. I think that's where the timeline is going, straight into what the newer games, the remakes, the 7, 8, and 9 are leading to into the future of the franchise. Now, of course, you can disagree with me. Let me know what you think in the comments below if you do agree, or if not, that's perfectly fine. Let's have a nice discussion about it, and thank you so much for watching my video, and let me know if, just let me know your thoughts, okay? Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys next time.